My mother stole my baby when I was only 15 years old and made me believe for almost 5 decades that she had been stillborn. For 47 years, I called Laura my sister without imagining that she was, in fact, my daughter. The truth only came to light after a DNA test. The brown envelope with the DNA test results trembled violently in my sweaty and trembling hands, as if it were alive and conscious of the devastation contained in its processed cellulose fibers, the paper making a dry, cutting noise that echoed like an apocalyptic thunder in the silent room where the air seemed to have solidified into invisible crystals of tension. Each oxygen molecule weighing tons on our lungs, compressed by the anticipation of the inevitable. While Laura, the woman I had affectionately called sister, during endless 47 years of fraternal complicity and unconditional affection, built on foundations that we now discovered were quicksand. Completely collapsed on the worn brown leather sofa in our living room, like a marionette whose strings had been simultaneously cut by an invisible scissor of fate, her entire body shaken by convulsive and primitive sobs that seemed to tear physical pieces from her soul and throw them against the beige walls that silently witnessed our tragedy. Tears descending in torrential floods down her face contorted into a mask of pain so deep that it seemed carved by centuries of suffering compressed into seconds. Her hoarse and broken voice repeating the same incomprehensible phrase like a painful and desperate mantra that reverberated through the walls covered with family photographs in golden frames that now seemed to cruelly mock our cultivated ignorance. She promised me with her right hand on her heart and her left on the Holy Bible that we would never discover the cursed truth. Promised looking directly into my green eyes that I inherited without knowing from whom. Swore by the memory of her dead father that she would take the terrible secret to the cold, dark grave where worms devour lies and truths with equal appetite. Repeatedly promised that it was for our own good, for the good of all of us, for the preservation of the family harmony that she so valued. It was a suffocatingly stifling December afternoon where the thermometer registered 38 degrees in the non-existent shade, the humid and sticky heat typical of the tropics gluing clothes to the body like an uncomfortable and oppressive second skin made of sweat and despair. The 3 ceiling fans spinning frantically at maximum speed without managing to minimally alleviate the sensation of atmospheric oppression that hung in the air loaded with static electricity and dark omens. The cicadas singing their monotonous and deafening chorus outside, as if announcing the family apocalypse that was unfolding within those 4 walls that had witnessed so many moments of joy now retroactively stained by the revelation. When our meticulously constructed family reality built emotional brick by emotional brick, and zealously protected like a sacred treasure during almost 5 entire decades of coexistence, that we judged harmonious, but that now revealed itself as an out of tune symphony, collapsed completely, irrevocably, catastrophically like the twin towers of our innocence before 3 sheets of letterhead paper with the blue and white logo of Genoma Brazil Genetic Laboratory that confirmed with implacable scientific precision of 99% statistical certainty the absolutely unthinkable, the impossible, the unimaginable, that not even in the worst nightmares had we contemplated. Laura was not my beloved youngest sister, as I had always believed, with unwavering conviction since my first nebulous moments of childhood consciousness when I saw her for the first time in the pink crib, but rather my biological daughter, my own red blood running in her veins, my flesh replicated in her cells. cruelly stolen from me at the most vulnerable and sacred moment of adolescent childbirth, when I was just 15 incomplete years of age and naivety, in a poorly lit public maternity ward with flickering fluorescent lamps and poorly equipped where the smell of cheap disinfectant could not mask the odor of human misery, where my own mother, Donna Mercedes, the woman who should protect me above all, orchestrated with surgical precision and psychopathic coldness, the most cruel, devastating, and unforgivable farce that a woman could commit against her own defenseless and unconscious teenage daughter. The genetic ancestry test that we had done out of apparently innocent and playful genealogical curiosity. Motivated by a shining and tempting Christmas promotion with 50% discount from an international company specializing in detailed mapping of ethnic origins that promised in colorful advertisements to reveal the mysterious geographical origins and precise percentages of ethnicities of our ancestors through meticulous and computerized analysis of mitochondrial and chromosomal DNA using cutting. Edge technology and sophisticated algorithms had inadvertently revealed, like a molecular Pandora's box, a truth so monstrous in its cruelty, so absolutely grotesque in its calculated perversity, that it seemed to have been torn with bloodied claws from the darkest and most gothic pages of a Victorian nightmare written by Mary Shelley in partnership with Edgar Allan Poe, or from an ancestral Greek tragedy, where the Olympian gods sadistically amuse themselves by torturing innocent mortals for sport. 99.9% of mathematically irrefutable statistical probability of direct biological maternity between Helena Santos Ferreira and Laura Santos Martinez, when the expected and normal results should show only the typical and predictable collateral kinship of biological sisters, with approximately 25% of shared DNA through common and random inheritance from the same parents. The digital numbers danced before my tearful eyes like indecipherable hieroglyphs of an ancient Egyptian curse, finally revealed after millennia of dormancy. Each percentage and specific genetic marker screaming in ultrasonic frequencies a truth that my adult brain flatly refused to process or accept, as if vehemently denying the scientific reality of the printed facts could somehow magically reverse what was already irremediably exposed and documented in the sequences of adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine of the genetic code that never lies. Never distorts, never participates in family conspiracies no matter how well-intentioned they may be. My adult and theoretically mature 47-year-old mind, trained and accustomed to processing complex and multifaceted information and making rational data. Based decisions in the stressful corporate environment where I worked as a human resources manager, dealing with daily dramas and conflicts, struggled desperately, frantically, pathetically like a shipwreck victim thrashing in turbulent waters to process and comprehend the overwhelming magnitude and infinite implications of that nuclear revelation that instantly and retroactively rewrote every stored memory, every lived moment, every family interaction of the last 47 years, as if it were a book whose pages were being simultaneously torn out and rewritten. While scattered and disordered adolescent memories long suppressed in the dark basement of the subconscious, carefully buried beneath geological layers and more sedimentary layers of false but comforting narratives, and distorted by endless decades of meticulously crafted maternal lies reinforced daily. Began to emerge painfully from the subconscious like bubbles of poisonous methane, slowly and inexorably rising to the oily and putrid surface of a deep, dark lake, polluted by toxic secrets that poisoned everything they touched. I could now recall with disturbing and cinematic clarity in vivid and sensorial details that seemed filmed in ultra high-definition 8K that stormy and apocalyptic dawn of March 1977 when the world seemed to be ending. The torrential and relentless rain beating on the windows of our small two-bedroom apartment in the North Zone like skeletal fingers of specters desperately trying to enter to witness the crime that would be committed. The excruciating and tearing pains that suddenly began during Friday dinner, and that ripped through my teenage abdomen like invisible claws of a wild beast trying to get out from inside me. Each contraction an explosion of agony that made me see colored stars dancing in the darkness. While my mother insisted with unwavering firmness and feigned medical authority that they were just severe menstrual cramps absolutely typical of teenagers in hormonal development, nothing to worry about, the urgent and terrifying trip to San Jose Public Hospital wrapped in conspiratorial secrecy and suffocating shame as if we were criminals fleeing the scene of a crime. The white and cold fluorescent lights flickering epileptically in the endless hospital corridor that seemed to extend to infinity like an Escher nightmare. The nauseating smell of formaldehyde and disinfectant that to this day causes me inexplicable nausea, and most importantly, crucially, devastatingly, that definitive and transforming moment etched in fire in my now recovered memory, when I clearly and distinctly heard an acute, desperate, and unmistakable cry of a healthy newborn baby echoing through the muffled delivery room, before completely losing consciousness under the effect of potent and unauthorized sedatives that were administered intravenously without my informed consent or knowledge. During all these long, endless, cruel years that stretched like elastic decades of a perpetual prison sentence served in absolute ignorance in a cell of gilded lies, Donna Mercedes had convinced me with manipulative mastery, worthy of the most perverse and skillful dictators and propagandists in human history, that I had suffered an acute and potentially fatal crisis of suppurated appendicitis, complicated by peritonitis, that almost killed me on that fateful night in March, that the pink, irregular and keloid scars that marked my belly like a topographic map of war, were the exclusive and unequivocal result of an extremely invasive and risky emergency surgery to save my life that hung by a thread during endless and anguishing hours on the improvised operating table, and that Laura, my supposed beloved and protected little sister, had been born prematurely but miraculously healthy from a late, unexpected, and completely miraculous pregnancy of her own at 25 years of age, after years of frustrated medical attempts and extremely expensive fertility treatments. A miraculous divine blessing sent by angels that arrived when she had completely lost all hope that she could have another child after me. Her supposedly only firstborn, who almost died in childbirth. The elaborate narrative was so convincing in its complexity, so detailed in its nuances and invented medical specificities, so obsessively reinforced by seemingly legitimate documents with official stamps and falsified signatures, and rehearsed testimonies from carefully instructed relatives, and some purchased ones that never, not even in my most paranoid dreams or moments of existential doubt, had I questioned its fundamental veracity or considered the possibility of such a monstrous lie. The elaborate, Baroque and Byzantine architecture of intrinsically interconnected lies like a giant spiderweb that supported as pillars of fake marble imported from imaginary perfection that left no loose ends. Carrara, our dysfunctional family dynamics for almost half a century was simultaneously impressive and admirable for its labyrinthine complexity, worthy of an international espionage novel written by John le Carré, and absolutely terrifying for its mathematically precise, calculated cruelty and emotional coldness of a premeditated crime executed with frightening. Donna Mercedes, I later discovered through obsessive investigations, that I conducted like a maddened private detective, seeking fragments of truth in dusty public archives, old certificates, forgotten hospital records, and suppressed memories of distant relatives. Had forged with the artisanal expertise of a master forger official hospital documents using influential political connections that her traditional and decadent aristocratic family maintained in the corrupt administrative spheres of the city. Strategically bribed with surgical precision key maternity hospital officials, with amounts that represented tempting fortunes for poorly paid and desperate workers of the gutted public health system, created a narrative so convincing, detailed, and emotionally manipulative about her supposed miraculous late pregnancy, that even my father, Jose Ferreira, an honest, hardworking and naive man who blindly and unconditionally trusted the wife he loved with religious devotion, firmly believed without questioning the fabricated story until his last gasping breath before dying of a massive myocardial infarction exactly 10 years ago on a Sunday morning after Mass, and mainly, criminally, monstrously, unforgivably, had deprived me of the fundamental, inalienable, sacred and constitutional right to raise my own daughter, perversely transforming her through fraudulent documentation into my sister through psychological manipulation so profound, so comprehensive, so meticulously executed over decades that it completely, irreversibly, and tragically altered the course of two lives that should have been intertwined as mother and daughter, but were forced to exist as sisters. Laura grew up affectionately calling me sis with that sweet and melodic childish accent that she never completely lost even in her professional adulthood, the word coming from her lips like poisoned honey that I swallowed unknowingly. While I protectively saw her as the fragile, delicate, and adorable little sister who needed protection from the real and imaginary dangers of the cruel world, with the fierce instinct of a lioness that I now crystal clearly understand to be maternal rather than fraternal. We developed over endless decades a genuine, deep, intense and loving sisterly relationship, tragically based on a fundamental corrosive lie that invisibly gnawed at the foundations of our connection like termites, devouring the supporting beams. We shared silly and precious teenage secrets whispered under flannel blankets during stormy nights, with lightning illuminating our frightened faces when she would run barefoot and scared to my room begging for protection against the thunder. We fought fiercely and dramatically over clothes borrowed without permission that she would stealthily take from my wardrobe and return wrinkled and stained. We competed silently but intensely for parental attention and approval at elaborate family dinners, where every compliment was measured, weighed, and compared like gold on a precision scale. We built precious and irreplaceable decades of seemingly rock-solid family memories, artificial white Christmases with carefully wrapped and exchanged gifts, birthdays with multi-layered frosted cakes, vacations on distant and paradisiacal northeastern beaches, graduations celebrated with tears of pride, weddings witnessed in Baroque churches, births celebrated in private maternity hospitals, upon completely false, rotten, corrupted, and eaten. Away foundations that now spectacularly and loudly collapsed like a castle of marked playing cards during an earthquake in the face of the cold. Impersonal and irrefutable scientific truth printed in colorful graphs on those genetic results that could not be denied, questioned, reinterpreted, or ignored, no matter how desperately we wish they were a laboratory error. Roberto, my dedicated husband and partner of 23 years of solid marriage built on true love and genuine partnership, held my right hand with an almost painful strength that would leave marks, his calloused fingers intertwined with mine in a desperate and touching attempt to anchor me to physical reality, while the conceptual world spun uncontrollably around me like a maddened carousel, the walls seeming to liquefy and undulate like mirages in the desert, as I uselessly tried to form coherent words that made sense. Grammatically correct sentences with subject, verb, and predicate, rational and logical explanations to explain to Laura that she was simultaneously, paradoxically, impossibly, schizophrenically my emotional sister of a lifetime shared in complicity, and my biological daughter cruelly stolen at birth by our own mother who was now a grandmother. How to explain to a 47-year old, accomplished, and established woman, with a structured family of her own, established professional career, and consolidated psychological identity, that her entire fundamental existence, every official document with her name, every cherished childhood memory, every basic and elementary understanding about herself was based on a maternal fraud so comprehensive and systematic that it left no aspect of her life untouched by the lie. How to process the incomprehensible and paradoxical fact that I had given birth at 15, unconscious and drugged, without even having full awareness or clear memory of the most transformative and sacred event a woman can experience? How to confront Donna Mercedes about an emotional crime so monstrous in its conception, so fundamentally cruel in its execution, so absolutely unforgivable in its consequences, that there were no adequate words in any known human vocabulary to properly describe it. The familiar room spun dizzily around me like a crazed, ungoverned carousel in Hell's amusement park, the familiar furniture seeming to float and dissolve at the edges of my peripheral vision blurred by tears, while Laura rose slowly, very slowly, as if in slow motion, her face swollen and deformed by crying, wet with tears that wouldn't stop falling in salty cascades. Staring at me with green eyes identical to mine in every nuance and shade, eyes that I had always naively and stupidly attributed to shared family genetics through generations of common ancestors, but which now revealed crystalline, painful, and undeniably the obvious, glaring, wide-open truth of our direct and immediate biological mother-daughter connection that had been criminally denied. Distorted, perverted, and corrupted during almost 5 decades of coexistence, based on lies so deeply rooted in the soil of our psyche that they had become our unquestionable reality, our existential foundations upon which we built our adult identities. Helena, my sister, my mother, my God in heaven, I don't even know what to call you anymore, how to think about you. How to process your existence in my life, Laura whispered with a choked, hoarse, and trembling voice that could barely form words through the sobs that shook her body, each syllable an agony to pronounce, her delicate hands with dark red painted nails trembling uncontrollably as much as mine while holding her own crumpled in tear. Stained copy of the test results as if the paper might burn her fingers or explode at any moment. I always knew, always felt in some deep, inexplicable, and inaccessible place within me, like ancestral knowledge engraved in DNA, that something was fundamentally wrong in our dynamic. Always felt a different connection, more intense, more visceral. more primitive with you that I couldn't rationally explain even to myself in therapy sessions. When we were children, remember how I obsessively, desperately, pathologically insisted on sleeping in your room even when Mom, Grandma, that cursed woman who deceived us our whole lives, fought fiercely with me and carried me back to my own room as I cried and kicked? Remember how I would cry uncontrollably, hysterically, as if the world was literally ending whenever you left for high school, and I was still too small to go along, staying with my face pressed against the window, fogged by my breath, waiting for you to return like an abandoned puppy? Remember that terrible and traumatic time when I had a high fever of 40 degrees Celsius at 5 years old? Delirious and frantically calling for you, not her. And I would only stop crying and could sleep peacefully when you took me in your frail arms and sang that lullaby about paper boats, not when she tried to comfort me with her cold liar's hands. Her words, broken by sobs and chokes, awakened memories long dormant in the dusty attic of my mind that now gained completely different, revealing, devastating meanings under the blinding light of truth. They weren't simply demonstrations of intense love between close and affectionate sisters, but the primordial, biological, undeniable, ancestral instinct of a child desperately and unconsciously seeking the true mother who had been cruelly denied to her from her first breath. Instinctively trying through behaviors that psychologists would call attachment seeking to rebuild a sacred and necessary maternal bond that had been violently broken at birth by the arbitrary, selfish, and cruel decisions of a woman who arrogantly believed she had the divine right to redesign others' destinies as if they were paper dolls in her authoritarian hands. As if she were a Greek goddess weaving the threads of fate without caring about the suffering of the mortals caught in her web of lies. In that devastating moment of cascading revelations that accumulated like successive waves of an emotional tsunami, threatening to drown us all in its aquatic fury. We distinctly and with frightening clarity heard the familiar metallic sound of the key turning in the rusty lock of the solid wood front door, the characteristic creaking of hinges that needed oil, and Donna Mercedes entered the house with confident and firm steps of someone who believes they are arriving in their secure kingdom, carrying colorful supermarket bags with familiar logos. Her face initially showing the customary and rehearsed smile of a matriarch satisfied with the month's shopping that quickly, drastically, cinematically transformed into a deathly pallor like museum wax, when her experienced and always attentive brown eyes instantly captured like a radar the scene of emotional destruction. Papers chaotically scattered over the tempered glass coffee table like evidence of a crime. Our devastated expressions mixing profound shock, absolute horror, disbelief, and barely contained fury that threatened to explode like a nuclear bomb at any moment. She let the heavy bags fall with a dull thud on the polished and waxed wooden floor. Cans rolling noisily and metallically across the floor in random directions like billiard balls, crushed tomatoes staining the floor, eggs breaking and spreading in yellow puddles, while her brown eyes, always so authoritarian, controlling, manipulative, and intimidating, showed for the first time in decades of coexistence the genuine, visceral, primitive fear of a cornered animal that knows it has been caught in the trap, of someone whose most terrible, heinous, and well-kept crime had been finally, inevitably, irrevocably discovered by the inexorable and merciless march of scientific and technological progress. "You did the DNA test," she said simply in a monotone and resigned voice. not as a curious question or surprise, but as a fatalistic observation of someone who had always known in her guilty soul that this judgment day would come, that the monstrous secret she had kept with iron determination and constant paranoid vigilance for 47 years had been exposed by the relentless modern science that she had not foreseen or considered when she architected her elaborate farce in the primitive and innocent technological limitations of the 70s, when DNA was just a mysterious acronym in biology textbooks. How could you do this to me, your own flesh and blood daughter? How could you steal my baby, my daughter, my blood? My flesh, my continuation in the world, and raise her as my sister in such a cruel and unnecessary lie? My voice exploded in a primal, animalistic, savage scream that seemed to emerge from the darkest and most primitive depths of an ancestral pain that I didn't even know I carried, buried under geological layers of manufactured normalcy. Decades of brutally suppressed and denied maternal instinct exploding in volcanic fury that made me violently tremble from head to toe, as if possessed by all the mothers in history who had their children stolen. I was 15, mother. Just 15 years old. I was a frightened, vulnerable, defenseless child, a virgin until just months before. You sedated me like an animal in a slaughterhouse. Stole my baby like a sordid thief in the night and made me believe throughout my adult life that I had undergone an appendectomy. How did you sleep peacefully at night knowing what you had done? How could you look me in the eyes every morning at breakfast? How could you bear to see me unconsciously searching for something I lacked without knowing what it was? Each word was spat with accumulated and fermented poison from almost 5 decades of systematic manipulation and unrecognized psychological abuse, while Roberto tried uselessly to calm me with gentle touches on the shoulder and words whispered in my ear that couldn't penetrate the red fog of primitive rage clouding my vision and judgment. And Laura remained paralyzed on the sofa like a biblical pillar of salt, processing in real time with her adult brain the incomprehensible and paradoxical reality that the woman she had called mother throughout her conscious existence was actually her usurping grandmother, and that her true biological mother, the one who gestated and gave birth to her, had been deprived of even the basic and fundamental awareness of her existence in the world, transformed into a sister through a bureaucratic and emotional monstrosity unprecedented in the history of dysfunctional families. Donna Mercedes straightened her posture with that studied and rehearsed theatrical dignity she always used as psychological armor to justify her most authoritarian, controlling, and questionable decisions. Her 72 years of experience in manipulation, not diminishing one bit the intimidating force of her domineering personality that had shaped, distorted, and controlled our lives through elaborate lies presented as loving and necessary maternal protection. It was for your own good, dear Helena. It was always for your own good and for Laura's good. For the preservation of both your futures, she said with a disturbing, almost supernatural calmness that grotesquely contrasted with the devastating emotional chaos her actions had caused, as if decades of internal rationalization and mental gymnastics had created an impenetrable shield against any feeling of guilt or remorse. You were 15, Helena, 15 years old, a girl. You were a brilliant student with exemplary grades, medals of merit, with a promising future ahead, guaranteed federal university, a respectable career, a dignified life. That worthless Carlos was 18 and disappeared like smoke in the wind as soon as he learned of the pregnancy, leaving you alone, desperate, helpless, destroyed, and pregnant without any support. If I hadn't made this difficult but absolutely necessary decision, you would have completely and irreversibly destroyed your life caring for a baby as a teenager, without a father, without support, without structure. I did what any truly responsible and loving mother would do to protect her daughter's future. I took full responsibility and raised Laura as my own daughter with all love and dedication, allowing you to have the prosperous and successful life you deserved and achieved through your efforts. Her calculated and rehearsed words, delivered with the unwavering conviction of someone who spent entire decades internally justifying an unforgivable emotional crime through elaborate mental gymnastics and psychological sophistry, only exponentially intensified my incandescent fury because they revealed the supreme arrogance, the unbelievable hubris. The pathological megalomania of someone who sincerely believed she had the divine right to rewrite others' destinies based on her own arbitrary and prejudiced judgments about what would be better for others, as if she were an omniscient and omnipotent goddess playing with the lives of inferior mortals incapable of deciding for themselves. Better for whom exactly, Mother? For you? Who desperately wanted to maintain the immaculate appearances of a perfect and respectable family for hypocritical society. For you, who couldn't bear the devastating social shame and the viperous tongues of gossiping neighbors commenting that you had a pregnant teenage daughter in an era when that was an unforgivable scandal equivalent to prostitution. You stole my fundamental and inalienable right to choose. You stole my sacred and biological right to be a mother. You stole from Laura the basic and human right to know who her true mother was. You built a monstrous lie, an elaborate farce, a macabre theater that perversely distorted the lives of all of us, including your own. My voice broke into convulsive and uncontrollable sobs when the full, overwhelming, incomprehensible magnitude of what had been stolen from me began to crystallize with painful clarity, sharp as broken glass. Not just a flesh and blood daughter, but 47 precious and irrecoverable years of authentic motherhood, of unique and sacred moments, of fundamental identity as a woman and mother. The right to see the first wobbly steps, hear the first babbled words, heal the first injuries with magical kisses, teach how to tie shoelaces, brush hair for school, help with homework, talk about first teenage love, be present at every important milestone, not as a distant sister, but as a true mother. Laura finally found her voice amid the chaotic whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Rising from the sofa with legs trembling like bamboo in the wind, threatening to give way and collapse at any moment, and facing Donna Mercedes with an explosive mixture of deep incredulity and visceral betrayal that seemed physically painful to witness, her green eyes identical to mine blazing with a volcanic fury I had never seen before in her normally serene features. Mother. And no, I don't even know what to call you anymore, or how to think of you as a person, as a human being capable of such cruelty, she screamed with palpable despair that echoed off the walls, the words coming out fragmented, confused, intertwined like the tangled threads of a life that she discovered was a complete fiction, a matrix of lies. You raised me in an absolute and comprehensive lie. My entire life, every moment lived, all my constructed identity, absolutely everything I believed to be fundamental and immutable truth about myself, was your fabrication, a piece of grotesque theater where I was the lead actress without knowing I was on stage. How could you look at me every day during breakfast with toast, Sunday lunches with pasta, Christmases with turkey. Birthdays with frosted cake, knowing you were cruelly depriving me of my true mother, who was there by my side believing she was my sister? How could you sleep peacefully at night in your air-conditioned bedroom, knowing you had built our entire lives on a heinous crime against your own daughter and granddaughter? Laura began to dangerously hyperventilate. Her breathing short and rapid as if oxygen had become scarce, the full impact of the revelation creating a real, time identity crisis that was agonizing, heart-wrenching, devastating to witness, like watching someone discover that their entire existence was a simulation, an elaborate lie by those who should protect her above all else. The oppressive silence, heavy as lead, that followed the last desperate cry was broken only by the syncopated, synchronized sobs of three women of three generations whose lives had been irrevocably, permanently, tragically altered by unilateral and authoritarian decisions made in a poorly lit and poorly equipped maternity ward exactly 47 years ago. When destiny was rewritten by maternal hands that did not have that divine right, when a baby was torn from the unconscious arms of her teenage mother and handed to a grandmother who would become a usurping mother. Roberto, the only external element to that Shakespearean family tragedy of epic proportions, desperately tried to process the surreal and Kafkaesque information that his dedicated wife had been a teenage mother at 15 without awareness or memory of the fact that his beloved and close sister-in-law was actually his unrecognized biological stepdaughter and that his apparently respectable and religious mother-in law had orchestrated a family fraud of epic proportions that rivaled the most elaborate Greek tragedies of Sophocles and Euripides. The commercial DNA test, which was supposed to be just a fun, playful, and educational exploration of our ancestral origins for a family genealogy project we were putting together to gift the children at Christmas with an illustrated family tree, had inadvertently transformed into the cursed key of Pandora that unlocked a secret so devastating, so absolutely destructive, so fundamentally transformative, that it threatened to completely pulverize the foundations of our shared existence, built upon lies crystallized into false reality. Donna Mercedes, realizing with her calculating and manipulative astuteness that her rational and pragmatic justifications were not finding the merciful absolution she desperately expected, tactically changed her strategy like a general recalculating his approach on the battlefield, and began to reveal previously hidden and guarded details of the past that she had carefully kept as cards up her sleeve for this moment, trying to contextualize her actions within the oppressive social and cultural limitations of the time. As if historical context could somehow absolve the unforgivable crime. You two don't understand. You cannot understand how it was in those difficult, cruel, and relentless times, she said with growing urgency in her voice, her previously controlled composure acquiring an almost pleading and desperate tone that I had never heard in decades of living under the same roof. A 15-year old pregnant girl in 1977 was a sentence of absolute, irrevocable, definitive social death. You would have been summarily expelled from Santa Teresa Catholic School without right to defense, Helena. Your name would be forever tarnished in the records. You would be treated as a pariah, a lost woman, a tramp, a prostitute by the cruel moral standards of the time. People would spit on you in the street, cross to the other side to avoid greeting you, whisper behind your back. And Laura, my God in heaven, growing up as the illegitimate daughter of a teenage single mother, would carry this terrible stigma for the rest of her life like a mark of Cain. Doors would close before even knocking, opportunities would deny before asking. I did what needed to be done to protect you both from that relentless social cruelty, even if it meant carrying this terrible secret alone throughout life, even if it consumed me from within like acid corroding metal. You weren't protecting me from absolutely anything. You were protecting your own immaculate reputation, your precious social image, your status as a respectable family. I shouted, with the raw and painful truth finally emerging crystalline after decades of systematic denial and manipulation, each word a poisoned arrow targeting her stone heart. You have always been obsessively, sickly concerned with what others thought, with maintaining an image of a perfect, respectable, and enviable family for the hypocritical and gossiping society. You sacrificed my motherhood, my most basic and sacred right, on the bloody altar of your sick social vanity. And the worst, the most cruel, the most unforgivable of all, is that you made me live a lie so complete, so comprehensive, so perfectly executed that I didn't even remotely suspect. You transformed my biological daughter into my sister through fraudulent paperwork and made me believe with absolute conviction that this was normal, natural, true, unquestionable. You are a monster skillfully disguised as a protective and loving mother. The words, heavy as molten lead, hung in the charged air like toxic smoke from an uncontrolled emotional fire. Poisoning decades of previously precious memories that now needed to be painfully re-examined and reinterpreted, under the cruel, blinding, and revealing light of this devastating truth. Each family photograph, framed in silver where Laura and I appeared, smiling as accomplice sisters, was now a disturbing and macabre document of an emotional fraud elaborated with criminal mastery. Each birthday cheerfully celebrated with the wrong date marked on the calendar, each school document meticulously filled with false information and forged signatures, each family story told and retold with affection during endless Sunday dinners with the family gathered. Everything was an integral and necessary part of a carefully maintained fiction, through constant vigilance that had become our unquestionable reality, for too long to be simply discarded or forgotten, like a cancer that had metastasized throughout the family body. Laura began frantically connecting dots that had remained loose, inexplicable, and disturbing throughout her entire life. Strange and unsettling moments that now made terrible and revealing sense under the blinding light of the truth, finally exposed like a decomposing corpse. I remember with frightening and vivid clarity one time, when I was about 8 years old, curious and meddlesome, I found an old, dusty cardboard box full of ancient photographs in the stuffy attic and saw a photo of you, Helena. Clearly a teenager, perhaps 14 or 15 years old, who seemed to be visibly pregnant, with a prominent and unmistakable belly under a cheap floral cotton dress. When I innocently showed it to you, she accusingly pointed with a trembling finger at Donna Mercedes. You violently snatched the photo from my small hand as if it burned or contained a curse. Said sharply that it was just a trick of light and shadow, that Helena was just wearing a puffy dress that created an illusion of volume where there was none. You burned the photograph on the gas stove right in front of my frightened and confused eyes and made me solemnly promise with my hand on the Bible never to mention it again to anyone, not even to Helena, under threat of severe punishment. And that memorable and traumatic time when Aunt Carmen drank too much red wine at Christmas 1985 and started saying something incomprehensible and apparently meaningless about Helena's baby who was born on that rainy night before you practically dragged her forcibly by the hair out of the house and never invited her to our family gatherings again. Cutting off relations completely as if she had committed the worst of crimes. Each retrospective revelation added a new layer of gothic horror to the growing and nauseating understanding of how meticulously, obsessively, sickly Donna Mercedes had constructed and maintained her impenetrable fortress of interwoven lies. Ruthlessly and mercilessly, silencing anyone who even remotely threatened to expose the inconvenient truth, destroying compromising evidence like a professional criminal trained by the KGB, manipulating narratives with the surgical precision of a neurosurgeon, and creating an elaborate and convincing alternative version of reality that she imposed on all of us with absolute, unquestionable, and dictatorial authority. The totalitarian control she exercised over our lives was comprehensive in its Orwellian completeness, determining not only what we believed about our nebulous past, but fundamentally shaping our identities, personalities, neuroses, and relationships in ways that only now we were beginning to understand in their devastating totality and infinite ramifications. And my biological father? Laura suddenly asked with desperate urgency that cut through the air, turning to me with an expression of anguished plea that broke the heart into 1,000 pieces. Carlos, she mentioned the name Carlos when she was pathetically justifying herself. Do you clearly remember him? What was he like physically and psychologically? Does he know that I exist in the world? Did he know about the pregnancy before running away, or did he run away precisely because of it? The questions came in a machine gun burst, each one more painful and difficult to answer than the previous one, because I could barely access coherent and reliable memories from that traumatic period that my adolescent brain had apparently blocked as an adaptive psychological defense mechanism. Aided by the powerful and unauthorized sedatives that Donna Mercedes had administered to ensure that I had no full awareness or clear memory of the birth and its circumstances. Scattered and disconnected fragments of memory began to emerge painfully like stroboscopic flashes of an old film damaged by water and time. Carlos Mendonça, the older, rebellious and dangerously attractive boy from the neighborhood, with his hypnotizing green eyes inherited from Portuguese ancestors and crooked smile of a Brazilian James Dean, that had completely seduced me at 14 innocent and inexperienced years. The stolen and forbidden afternoons hidden after school in the vacant lot covered with tall grass behind the abandoned soccer field. The furtive and wet kisses. The inexperienced and awkward touches that led to the inevitable on a hot January afternoon. The terrifying and paralyzing discovery of pregnancy through a cheap pharmacy test done secretly in the dirty school bathroom, with hands shaking so much that I could barely hold the test. His cowardly and instantaneous disappearance like smoke when I told him about the baby on a rainy February afternoon in the same vacant lot where we had loved each other, and my mother taking absolute and dictatorial control of the situation with frightening military efficiency that allowed no questions, hesitations, or resistance of any kind. He fled cowardly like a rat as soon as he knew about the pregnancy. I managed to articulate between bitter tears that burned like acid on my cheeks. He had just turned 18 and simply disappeared from town like smoke in the following dawn. I never saw him again, nor did I hear any direct news. He probably doesn't even know you were born alive and healthy. Much less that you were raised as my sister in this whole grotesque charade. Roberto, who had remained in respectful silence, processing the tsunami of revelations that threatened to drown us all in its murky waters, finally intervened with the grave and measured voice of reason that momentarily cut through the emotional chaos like a lighthouse in a maritime storm. We need to think pragmatically and rationally about what to do now with this devastating information. We cannot change the past, however horrible, traumatic, and unjust it may have been, but we need to consciously decide how to move forward with this truth exposed in all its cruelty. Helena, Laura. You two were innocent victims of a monstrous and unforgivable manipulation that neither of you deserved, but you are still undeniably mother and daughter biologically, genetically, even though you have emotionally lived as sisters. This doesn't erase the genuine and deep love you feel for each other. It just fundamentally transforms its nature and meaning in ways we'll need to navigate carefully and with therapy. His well-intentioned and sensible words, though rational and pragmatic, only cruelly highlighted the impossible and Kafkaesque complexity of the labyrinthine situation in which we found ourselves trapped. How could Laura and I even begin to rebuild our relationship now, after everything? Would we continue being sisters emotionally, since that's how we've known each other all along? Would we try to artificially forge a mother-daughter relationship after 47 years lived as sisters? Was it even psychologically possible to undo decades of mental conditioning and embrace a truth so belatedly revealed? And what to do with Donna Mercedes? The Machiavellian architect of this tragedy, who still stubbornly insisted she had acted out of love and maternal protection. Dr. Alexandra Fernandez, the meticulous and competent genetic doctor who had conducted our ancestry test with scientific rigor, had included a carefully worded personal note in the results after noticing the dramatic and disturbing discrepancy between the expected relationship of sisters and that revealed by the genetic markers of mother and daughter. Cases like this, although statistically rare in the order of 0.01% of tests performed, occur more frequently than society would like to admit or openly discuss. He had written with studied professional delicacy and evident compassion. I strongly recommend specialized and continued psychological support with professionals experienced in family trauma for all parties involved, as the psychological impact of such discoveries can be absolutely devastating, lasting, and even traumatic if not properly processed. I am available to clarify any technical questions about the genetic results and their medical, legal, and even criminal implications if necessary. His clinical and distant note seemed almost absurdly inadequate and insufficient in the face of the emotional earthquake of magnitude 10 that was systematically destroying the foundations of our family existence. But it was all that cold and impartial science could offer in the face of the visceral and uncontrollable human chaos unfolding in our devastated lives. Donna Mercedes, realizing with her manipulative astuteness, trained by decades of constant practice, that her historical and contextual justifications were not having the desired effect of merciful absolution, or at least empathic understanding, tried a different and more pragmatic approach, calculatingly appealing to the potentially devastating practical consequences of publicly exposing the inconvenient truth that had remained buried for so long. Think very carefully, with a cool and rational head, without being carried away by the emotion of the moment. Before making this public and completely destroying everything we have built with so much sacrifice and dedication over decades, she warned, with the cold and calculating pragmatism that always characterized her most important and controversial decisions, her voice acquiring a tone of veiled threat that gave me chills. Laura, you have impressionable and sensitive teenage children, 16-year... old Lucas and 14-year-old Marina, who firmly and unquestioningly believe that Helena is their dear and close aunt, who has always spoiled them with gifts and affection. How are you going to explain to them that your beloved aunt is actually your unknown biological mother, and that the grandmother they love is actually their great-grandmother? How will you destroy their innocence with this sordid revelation? Helena, your impeccable professional reputation earned with so much effort and dedication over decades, your solid and stable marriage with Roberto, who has always been your safe harbor, your respected position in the community. Everything can be irreversibly affected, stained, destroyed if this sordid story comes to light publicly. People will talk, they will speculate, they will judge. Sometimes, dears, some truths are better left buried in the past for the greater good of all involved, especially innocent children. What's done is done and cannot be undone, so why cause more unnecessary suffering? Donna Mercedes' poisonous and manipulative words about protecting reputations and sparing children revealed her fundamentally narcissistic and controlling nature. Even in the face of complete and devastating exposure of her heinous emotional crimes, she was still desperately trying to maintain some control over the narrative, over our lives, over our future decisions. As if she had any moral right or authority to give opinions after what she had done. But her veiled threats and emotional blackmail only solidified my iron determination to finally confront the truth in all its painful complexity, regardless of the social or professional consequences that might follow. You still don't understand, even after everything has been exposed. That you've completely lost any right to determine what's best for us? My voice came out hoarse but determined, each word heavy with decades of usurped maternal authority. You had 47 years to voluntarily reveal the truth, to correct your monstrous mistake, to give us the chance to process this reality with adequate time and therapy. You chose to maintain the lie until forced by modern science to admit it. Now the consequences are yours to bear, not ours to hide. Laura, processing the layers of manipulation that continued even after the revelation, rose with a newly discovered dignity that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep and ancestral within her. My children deserve to know the truth about their lineage. About who their biological relatives really are, she declared with surprising firmness. I will not perpetuate your sick cycle of lies to the next generation. Lucas and Marina are strong and intelligent enough to process this information with proper support. Better they find out now through us with love and care than through another DNA test a few years from now, repeating this nightmare. The mention of Donna Mercedes' grandchildren, or were they great-grandchildren, seemed to finally break something fundamental in her carefully maintained composure. For the first time in my life, I saw genuine tears, not theatrical or manipulative ones, running down the aged face of the woman who had been simultaneously my mother and tormentor. I truly believed I was doing what was best. She whispered, her voice breaking like fine glass. Each day that passed made it more impossible to reveal. How could I tell when you were 20 and in college, 30 and planning your wedding, 40 with your life established? The right moment never came, and the lie became our reality. Roberto, always pragmatic but compassionate, suggested with his characteristic wisdom, "We need professional help to navigate this. It's not something we can resolve among ourselves without specialized mediation. I know a psychologist who specializes in family secrets and generational trauma, Dr. Mariana Lopez. I suggest we schedule an urgent joint session before making any decisions about how to proceed publicly." In the days that followed, while we waited for the appointment scheduled for the following week, our home became an emotional minefield where every everyday conversation carried the weight of the revelation. Laura had temporarily moved to a hotel, needing physical space to process the implosion of her identity. Donna Mercedes remained locked in her room. Emerging only for silent and uncomfortable meals, where the clinking of silverware was the only sound. It was during this emotional limbo period that I decided to look for information about Carlos Mendonça, Laura's biological father, who had disappeared like smoke 7 years ago. Through obsessive internet searches, public records, and social media, I discovered that he had moved to São Paulo, built a respectable life as a civil engineer, married a teacher named Beatriz, and had 2 children, Laura's biological half-siblings whose existence she never knew about. The photographs on Facebook showed a gray-haired man, but still with those hypnotic green eyes that had seduced me in my adolescence. Now surrounded by an apparently happy and established family. The question consuming me was, should I contact him? Did he have the right to know he had a daughter? Did Laura want to meet her biological father after a lifetime without knowing of his existence? Each decision seemed to carry monumental consequences that branched out like fractures in broken glass. During the first session with Dr. E., Mariana Lopez, a middle-aged woman with kind but penetrating eyes that seemed to see through layers of denial and pain, the initial silence was broken by Laura. "I spent 47 years calling the wrong person mother. How do I process this? How do I reconcile decades of happy memories as sisters with the reality that we should have been mother and daughter?" The therapist? With clear experience in navigating complex family tragedies, carefully responded, "There is no manual for situations like this. What you lived as sisters was real. The love was genuine. The memories are valid. The revelation of biological truth doesn't erase the emotional truth of your shared experiences." The challenge now is to integrate these 2 seemingly contradictory realities into a new narrative that honors both the lived past and the revealed present. Donna Mercedes, forced to participate in therapy as a condition to remain in contact with us, finally began to reveal the deeper layers of her own traumatic history. "My mother died giving birth to me. She confessed in a particularly intense session. "I grew up hearing I was my own mother's killer. When Helena got pregnant so young, I saw in her the same fate, a life destroyed by early motherhood. I couldn't bear the idea. I know it doesn't justify, but it explains the madness of what I did." The revelation of her own generational trauma added layers of complexity to our family tragedy. Showing how patterns of pain and secrecy perpetuated through generations like a hereditary curse. But understanding didn't mean forgiving, at least not immediately. After weeks of intensive individual and group therapy, I made the decision to contact Carlos. The email I wrote and rewrote dozens of times was simple but loaded. "Carlos, I'm Helena Santos. I need to talk to you about something important related to 1977. Please call me." The call came the same day, his voice unrecognizable after so many decades, but still carrying traces of the Rio accent I remembered. Helena? My God, after all these years. I always wondered. The baby? She was born. She's alive. She was raised as my sister by my mother. We just discovered the truth through a DNA test. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening, broken only by heavy breathing that seemed to struggle against decades of guilt and regret. I was a coward. I ran when you needed me most. I've spent my entire life regretting it. Can I meet her? This decision wasn't mine to make. Laura? Informed about the existence and availability of her biological father, spent days agonizing over whether she wanted to open this door. It's already hard enough processing that Helena is my mother. Adding a father to the equation. I don't know if I can handle it emotionally, she confessed in a therapy session, but curiosity, that fundamental human force, eventually won. The meeting was set for a neutral cafe in the city center, mediated by Dr. Mariana, who insisted on being present to offer emotional support. Seeing Carlos and Laura together for the first time was surreal and painful, the same green eyes mirroring across generations, the same expressive hands gesturing identically without knowing, the same crooked smile appearing nervously. He cried openly upon seeing her, mumbling apologies that seemed inadequate for 47 years of absence. Laura remained reserved but curious, asking questions about family medical history, about her half-siblings, about why he had run away. I was 18 and terrified, he admitted with brutal honesty. My father said I had ruined my life, kicked me out. I ran to São Paulo like a coward. I tried to come back a year later, but your mother said you had moved, that she didn't want any more contact. I should have insisted, searched, fought for my right as a father, but it was easier to believe it was better this way. One more layer of Dona Mercedes's lies being exposed. She had actively prevented any possibility of Carlos participating, even if belatedly, in Laura's life. Each additional revelation made forgiveness more distant, more impossible, more unthinkable. Marcos, Laura's husband who had remained admirably supportive despite the chaos that had engulfed his family, finally expressed his perspective in a family session. I met Laura as Dona Mercedes's daughter, fell in love with her, built a life together. This revelation doesn't change who she fundamentally is. It only adds complexity to her story. I'm here to support her, whatever path we choose to follow. The children, Lucas and Marina, were eventually informed through a carefully planned conversation mediated professionally. Their reactions were surprisingly mature. Initial shock followed by curiosity about genetics and family history. So Aunt Helena is technically our biological grandmother? Lucas asked with the pragmatism typical of modern teenagers. This is like a real-life soap opera. Marina, always more emotional and empathetic, hugged me tightly. You're still our Aunt Helena who always loved us. Just now, we know that the love was even greater than we thought, right? The involuntary wisdom of the children offered a perspective that we adults, entangled in our pain and betrayal, had lost. Love remains, regardless of titles or biological relationships. It was possible to honor both biological truth and emotional truth simultaneously. Months passed, therapy continued, slowly, painfully. We began to build a new family narrative that incorporated the truth without erasing the past. Laura began to occasionally call me mother in private moments, testing how the word sounded, how it felt. She still called me Helena most of the time, and that was fine. We had 47 years of habit to undo or reshape. Dona Mercedes was diagnosed with early dementia during this period. A cruel irony of fate. The woman who had controlled the narrative with an iron fist was beginning to lose control of her own mind. In moments of lucidity, she begged for forgiveness that we weren't yet ready to grant. In moments of confusion, she called Laura baby Helena and asked to change her diapers, living in a reality where time had collapsed and all versions of us coexisted simultaneously. Carlos became a peripheral but consistent presence in Laura's life. Not as a father in the traditional sense, that role had been lost forever in the sands of time, but as a biological connection that offered context and history. His other children eventually met Laura, expanding her family in ways she had never imagined possible. Roberto, my safe harbor through this entire storm. We renewed our vows on our 25th wedding anniversary, an intimate ceremony that represented not only our commitment to each other, but our conscious decision to move forward despite the weight of the revealed past. Laura was my maid of honor, or would she be my daughter's witness? Traditional categories no longer applied to us. The legal process to correct documents was complex and lengthy. Lawyers specializing in family law were fascinated and horrified by our case. Eventually, we managed to add annotations to records indicating the true parentage, though the original documents remained for practical and complex legal reasons. The story eventually leaked to wider social circles, as Donna Mercedes had predicted. There was gossip, speculation, judgment. Some friends distanced themselves, uncomfortable with the complexity of our situation. Others drew closer, offering unconditional support. We learned who really mattered in our lives through this ordeal. Laura wrote a book about the experience. Sister, Daughter, A Journey of Genetic Discovery and Identity, which became a bestseller and helped other families dealing with similar revelations through DNA tests. The writing process was therapeutic for her, a way to reclaim her narrative and make sense of the chaos. I returned to studies, specializing in psychology focusing on family trauma and generational secrets. Transforming our personal tragedy into professional purpose to help others navigating similar waters. Donna Mercedes passed away 3 years after the revelation, dementia having progressed rapidly as if her brain, free from the weight of maintaining the lie, had simply given up. In her final days, she alternately called me daughter and mother, living in a fluid reality where time wasn't linear. Her last lucid words were, "Forgive me for loving wrong." I held her hand as she departed, Laura on the other side of the hospital bed. There was no complete forgiveness yet. Perhaps there never would be. But there was an acceptance that she had acted from a place of her own trauma and pain, perpetuating generational cycles of secrecy and control that she believed were love. At the funeral, Carlos appeared discreetly, paying respects to the woman who had denied his paternity but preserved his daughter. It was a moment of symbolic closure for all of us. Years passed. Laura and I developed a unique relationship that transcended traditional categories. We were sisters who discovered they were mother and daughter, navigating this uncharted territory with love, patience, and ongoing therapy. Her children call me Grandmonty, a combination of grandmother and godmother they created to capture our unique relationship. On quiet nights, when the weight of history seems lighter, Laura and I sit on the porch, sharing wine and memories, reconstructing our joint narrative. We talk about the signs we missed, the moments that now make different sense. The love that always existed regardless of titles. You know what's strangest? Laura told me on one of those nights, the stars witnessing our conversation. I always felt you were more than a sister. I thought it was just because we were very close. But now I know it was the biological mother-daughter bond trying to express itself through the imposed limitations. I miss you even when you're here, I replied, the words carrying the weight of lost decades. It's as if a part of me always knew that something essential had been stolen, but couldn't name what it was. Our relationship would never be conventional, would never fit perfectly into predefined categories. But it was ours, authentic. Built on the finally revealed truth and the love that survived the lie. The DNA test that began as genealogical curiosity had shattered and reconstructed our family in unimaginable ways. We discovered that family is both biology and choice, both truth and lived experience, both what should have been and what was. Laura occasionally still calls me sis out of habit. And I still see her as my little sister in moments of distraction. But now we also allow ourselves the mother-daughter moments that were stolen. The longer hug, the extra care during illness, the conversations about motherhood with new perspective. We didn't recover the 47 lost years, that was impossible. But we built something new on the ruins of secrecy. Something honest and complex and uniquely ours. The truth, however late and painful, had freed us to love without the limitations imposed by the lie. In the last entry of the diary I began keeping after the revelation, I wrote, I became a mother at 15 without knowing. I discovered it at 47. I missed the first words, the first steps, the first tears and laughter. But I gained the truth, and with it, the possibility to love my daughter as a mother for the time we have left. It's not what should have been, but it's what we have. And that finally is enough. The house that witnessed the implosion of the lie now sheltered a complex but liberating truth. The photographs on the walls remained, but with new meaning, no longer evidence of an elaborate fraud. But records of real love that transcended the impossible circumstances of its expression. Laura and her children visit us on Sundays. Carlos occasionally joins us, bringing Laura's half-siblings. Roberto prepares his famous barbecue. We talk about trivialities and depths. We are a rebuilt family, imperfect, marked by tragedy, but united by conscious choice to move forward together. It's not the happy ending of fairy tales. It's a real ending, complex, bittersweet like life. The lie that defined us for 47 years had been exposed and transcended. In its place, we built a truth that, though painful, finally allowed us to be who we really were. Mother and daughter whom fate and human cruelty had transformed into sisters, but whom love and truth had finally reunited. Even if belatedly, even if imperfectly, but genuinely, authentically, truly. The DNA test had revealed more than genetic markers and ethnic ancestry. It had revealed the simultaneous human capacity for cruelty and love, for lies and truth, for destruction and reconstruction. We had been all these things, victims and survivors, sisters and mother-daughter, destroyed family and rebuilt family. In the end, we discovered that family is what we make with the cards we are dealt, even when we discover, decades later, that the game was rigged from the beginning. We play with the newly revealed rules now, creating our own path through the unmapped territory between what we were forced to be and what we truly are. The truth had set us free, not to be the family we should have been, but to be the family we chose to be now, with all our complexity, our pain transformed into wisdom, our love transcending the categories that tried to contain it. And so we continued, 3 generations of women marked by secrecy and revelation, lie and truth, loss and discovery, navigating together through the turbulent waters of our rewritten history toward a future that, for the first time in 47 years, would be built upon truth. Did you like Helena's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on the screen. Click there and I'll be waiting for you.